is landlocked. It doesn't have an outlet to the coast. So William Penn got Delaware as an outlet for Pennsylvania, which became a separate colony. And William Penn said the one major requirement, didn't say it the way I'm saying it now, but he was in his paragraph or so that he had written, that people had to sign. You had to believe in one Almighty God, one. And in Rhode Island, it was in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. That was the way in which you had to worship. There were no Muslims. There were no, and I won't start naming all the various religions. You had to believe the way that colony believed. In a town of 500 to 1,000, there was one church. When it got up near 1,000, a lot of times because the size of the church had to be mammoth, you would build another church. But basically, if you went to that church or that church, it was more or less the same thing with two different preachers. And people went to church with the understanding that that's where they're supposed to be. But if you did not go to church, these are some things that happened to you. You were fined, and some colonies pretty heavily. You were publicly reproved. You had to stand in the New England, you had to stand on the Commons, which is the center of town. And there, your sin would be pronounced to the public, and they all would shame you by looking at you. And then a prayer would be given for you, and you had to stand there for a while. Another thing was you were placed in stocks. You all know what those are. Stocks could be for as little as an hour and as long as 6 hours. You were placed on blocks. Your crime was written on a piece of paper or a piece of wood. They passed by and looked at you sitting on the blocks. And then another thing, you couldn't be in rare cases put in cages. The colony that loved to put people in cages was North Carolina. They loved cages for their people that did not like to go to church. And then you could be, this rarely happened, excommunicated from the church in a sense. They didn't call it that, but you were kicked out of the church. They realized the thing wrong with that is that the thing that had gotten that man or family kicked out of the church encouraged others to do the same thing for the same result. And that didn't seem to be something they wanted to do. You want to get into church, not find some way to give an excuse to stay out of church. They were whipped, and I mean whipped. And on at least 5 instances executed for not going to church. On Sunday, the one thing that some colonies did was pass all these rules and regulations of do's and don'ts. No loitering. And again, I won't go to every colony where they did this because several colonies did this and some did. In some cases, it's just one colony did it. You were not to walk or ride fast. You were not to travel unnecessarily. One man was stopped on the road in South Carolina and was asked why he was not in church. The road warden asked him, "Where are you going?" He said, "Oh, you haven't heard." And they said, "Heard what?" And they said that his wife had passed away in a nearby town, about 50 or 60 miles over. "Oh, no, brother, we had not heard that." They took off their hats, they bowed and said a prayer, and wished him well on his way. What he really was doing was going to that town because he had a little problem gambling. So he played chuck-a-luck. Chuck-a-luck is rolling dice. They rolled out some cards, yes, cards. They played cards and dice. I don't know how he did in that. And then he realized that if he went back to his colonial town, there he would be, and his wife would be very much alive. So they stayed there in that town for over a year, and finally one day she said she had to go back. She's tired of staying there. They were living with, she was with some relatives of some sort. "Let's go back." "No, stay here." "No, we're going back." She set her foot down, so they went back to the town in which he had ridden out of on a lie. One day, soon after they arrived in town, here she came down the sidewalk or boardwalk of the village town, and one of those men, one of the 2 men on the road that had seen the husband going to get his dead wife, or to her funeral in that town, almost fainted and ran because a ghost was coming down the street. There she was. To make this short story short and to the point, he spent for 2 weeks, 4 hours a day in stocks on the public square, and the town crier cried out his crime. He had committed several crimes, and that man, needless to say, never did that again. When they made these rules, they meant for you to keep them. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Another thing, you couldn't cook on the Sabbath. Couldn't make beds. Couldn't sweep. My James back there grinning. You couldn't cut hair. You couldn't shave. Couldn't work in the garden. Couldn't pick nuts or peas. Couldn't gather berries. Couldn't fish. And this virtually was in all 13 colonies. As time progressed towards the present, certain colonies began to get lax on that, but it started out pretty much that way in all of them. But certain colonies began to liberalize sooner than others did. In Connecticut, no woman could kiss her child on Sunday. That was against church laws. Could not kiss your baby or your child on Sunday. Or any Sabbath. Some colonies, no wringing out clothes on Sunday. I love this one. In Virginia, on Sunday, no swearing. No entertaining or corruption of servants. In New Hampshire, there was a law, no suicides on Sunday. Think about that. In Boston, a Captain Kimball had to spend 2 hours in the stocks in Boston's Commons for kissing his wife on his front doorstep. His crime was kissing his wife on the front doorstep. Never mind the fact he was a captain of a vessel that had returned from Asia, and he'd been gone for 3 years. He had not seen his wife in 3 years. They reminded him, had he not been gone so long, the punishment would have been 4 hours in the stocks, not 2. So he got off with, I guess, lenient treatment. One man was found in church twice. Once for taking his tobacco out of a tobacco box while the preacher was preaching, and secondly, when he shut the box, it made a noise. That was his second fine. When you go to church, one of the things that the church did for you is, theoretically, it made you a better Christian there. And all the rules and regulations that were there, in some cases did. But in some, it just infuriated them. And you could tell that in the writings of certain people who were skilled in writing and could read and write. The church building itself was usually square in cities or towns. I use the word cities loosely because you don't really have cities until the 1700s and late or mid-1700s then. Philadelphia was America's giant city along with New York and Boston. Those were the three big. But in most American towns, you had villages, or colonies I should say, you had villages, not cities. And in some of these towns and villages, the church was a very prominent thing in town. They were never painted. Oh, I forgot to say, you had the square church, and I mean square, not as much rectangular. Many of them had pyramid roofs. And the churches, there was really no paints in the colonies to speak of until the 1740s. Churches then began to be painted. I find this interesting. In New England, the churches were painted yellow, and in the southern colonies, they were painted red. And since paint would only stay on wood 2 or 3 years in those days, painting the church was an ever 2 or 3 year thing. So it, generally speaking, was used like inmates are here. It was a punishment for somebody that had broken some rule of the town. Their job was to paint the church. And notice, church and state are together here. not separated. I find that this was of some interest to me. In the southern colonies, you had log churches. Log churches that were a long way from home. And in most all the colonies, particularly the early colonies, wolves were a problem. And you had bounty hunters of wolves. When you entered the church, you would find all these notices on the front of the church, nailed to the front of the church, of the rules and regulations, first of the church and then of the town, which were sometimes very different, but they generally complement each other. One was not opposed to the other. In southern colonies, the most noticeable thing when we entered the church was it wasn't painted any color. It was log. And there were these wolf heads nailed to the side of the church. And one man one time was asked about that. Why do you hang wolves' heads on the side of the church with the blood running down the logs? Isn't that a desecration of your house? He said, no. The wolves are of the devil, and the blood is synonymous with the blood of Christ. And the man shut his mouth up because, as far as he could tell, it sounded halfway right. So that's why they hung the wolves' heads there, to remind people they were there. And I always found this of interest. When Harvard is our oldest college in this country, it's founded in 1636. And then the first meeting of Harvard College, the first thing they talked about was some method or way to keep the wolves out of the food for the men. And only men went to the early schools, you know that already. But of the men that they had defeated at Harvard, the wolves were getting the food supplies in some outside buildings. How to deal with the wolves. So wolves were a problem in all 13 colonies, but tended to be worse in New England than it did in southern colonies. Church oddities, I find not just the outside building, but some things on the inside. Many churches in all parts of the colonies had gun ports. You carried a rifle to church, and when church service started, somebody stood by the window with a loaded gun, watching to see if Indians were sneaking up on the church. Now, think about how hard it was for you to come to church tonight and what you're doing here. I was thinking one time, when these people were coming into American churches in the last year before, and killing people, we have people, and I brought a gun in the church. And you don't have to have a license now in Kentucky to carry a concealed weapon, as long as you're not a felon, because it's considered part of your Second Amendment right. I did have a permit to carry a concealed weapon. But many churches still have armed men at the doors of churches to forbid entrance by someone with an automatic rifle of some sort, killing parishioners in the church. And I thought, how far have we come? In colonial times, it was Indians outside the church. Today, it's somebody coming in with a rifle to kill everybody in church they can. We haven't progressed all that much, it seems. And then, in a few churches, particularly in North Carolina, where the Indians were particularly fierce, they had cannons on the roofs, and somebody up there not only to load them, but to fire them. And they stayed there during the service the whole time. You had lookouts. You have what were called coats of armor. And don't think of medieval armor like knights used to wear in jousting or in battle. Think of thick cloth that is loaded in the southern colonies with cotton, or in the northern colonies with wool, that if an Indian shot you with an arrow, the arrow would still go in you, but it would not penetrate so deeply. That was their armor. And many men who were at the gun ports or on the roof wore the armor. You had muskets, you had gunpowder, stored sometimes in the church. And churches rarely allowed fires to keep warm in the wintertime. That just was permitted. I'll tell you why in a few minutes. In a few churches, the Indians in most of the colonies had a peculiarity about them. In the southern colonies, they did not get along with the white people much at all. That was the most violent areas of the colonies. Virginia, particularly Virginia and the Carolinas. Indians were, figuratively speaking, on the warpath. In New England, the white people got along better with the Indians. It was the kind of people that came there, I think, made the difference. If you've never heard the story of Squanto or all the other Indians of the early colonial times, look them up sometimes under a computer if you choose to. I never do that, but they're there to tell you some things that the Indians did and things we did for them, that they could see the benefit of being a friend to each other. But in the southern colonies, that was not the case. You had isolated areas where Indians didn't behave that way, but in many places they did. And they would store gunpowder in the church because the Indians, for some reason, wouldn't go in the church. So the Indians wouldn't steal the gunpowder. The only thing wrong with that is that with the gunpowder stored in the church, and in some cases rifles, during a thunderstorm, everybody in the church ran out of the church and ran behind a tree to hide, because if lightning hit the church and hit that gunpowder, everybody's going to be going up or down. It's going to kill them all. So they had to make sure that they had to get out of that church. I find it interesting that lightning loves to hit trees too. So I'm not sure they were much safer behind the trees than they were in the church.